Hey guys, in today's video I'm super excited to bring you a memorable game I played on my road to the title at the 2024 Scrabble Players Championships held in South Bend, Indiana. Now, as most of you are probably aware, I just spent an entire week's worth of content on my channel going over my epic best of 5 finals match against fellow Grandmaster Ian Weinstein. I went through all of those games in painstaking detail, so I really hope you guys enjoyed that analysis, but we're not done. Those 5 games were not the only interesting and intense games of Scrabble I played a couple weeks ago in South Bend. Prior to that match, I had to get through 28 grueling rounds of Scrabble over the course of 4 days in order to secure my spot in the final alongside Ian. And over the next couple of weeks, I'm really excited to go over some of the more memorable games from this stretch. Of course, over 28 games, you're going to get some games that aren't very interesting. You're going to get some games where you draw both blanks and all the S's and bingo 5 times and win by 200, and you're going to get some games where you keep drawing all the I's and V's and W's and U's, and your opponent does the same thing to you. I'm not going to be going over those kind of games on my channel, but I do want to focus on games like the one I'm going to show you today that were really, really interesting. Now, the game I'm going to show you today is my round 28 match against longtime expert Chris Cree. This was the final match I played before the best of 5 final against Ian. Now, interestingly, going into this game, the stakes did not feel very high. I had clinched my berth in the final following my win in round 26. So that means in rounds 27 and 28, it didn't seem like I had that much to play for. Regardless of whether I won or lost this game to Chris, my spot in the finals against Ian was secure. So I went into this game feeling not a lot of stress and feeling like I wanted to put on a good performance. After all, I have high standards for myself and take a lot of pride in the way I play Scrabble, but not feeling a huge sense of stress to win this game. Now, as I'll talk about at the end of this video, this game actually, for a reason I couldn't have foreseen, turned out to have significant ramifications. But that's for later. Let's go ahead and jump into this game. Chris was first. I'm not going to have full racks for Chris this game, so I won't focus too much on his plays. But with an opening rack containing these 5 tiles, he opened with Dingy for 28 points. I had a bit of a Val-heavy rack to start off the game. 3 A's, 2 E's, an L, and an M. This rack isn't quite bad enough to justify exchanging, but I don't have any particularly exciting options on the board. I generated a bunch of mediocre plays, including Amma for 20 points overlapping Dingy, keeping A, E, E, L, a Gleam for 18 points through the G, keeping A, E, or Gallia for 12, or the plural Galliae for 14, also from the G. All of these plays have their pros and cons. I didn't like Amma because it gives back high-scoring overlaps on the 6th row, in particular using the triple letter score above the AN. A Gleam seemed like a reasonable option, but I wasn't too keen on leaving 2 vowels without a consonant to balance it out, and I was also worried that Chris could play next to the M down column L for a lot of points. Because of that, I ended up settling on the lower scoring option of Galliae, scoring just 14, but keeping the more balanced AM leave on my rack. I also figured by putting 3 consecutive vowels next to each other, the E, A, E, that might make it a little bit trickier for Chris to be able to overlap down the L column for a lot of points. It's pretty close. If you run a simulation using the computer engine Macondo, there is a slight preference for a Gleam, probably because it does score 4 more points, and at the end of the day, AE does still bingo more often than AM, because while it is vowel heavy, the E is a much, much better bingo tile than the M. So maybe a slight misjudgment on my part here, but all my options are reasonable. Chris responded with Verity to the Y for 24 points, taking a 52-14 lead. I drew another fairly clunky rack, pulling TTVW out of the bag. I have a bunch of mediocre options here to decide between once again. The first one I saw was VAW for 18 points, shedding the V and the W. This is okay, but I wasn't a huge fan of the AIMTT leave with the duplicated T's. Then I noticed the option I eventually went with, Vim for 25 points above the D and the I in Dingy. I do still keep the duplicated T's, but I figure this way at least I get 7 more points, and I also stop some high-scoring plays for Chris. If he were to have drawn the Q for QI or the X for XI out of the bag, he could score a lot by overlapping the I in Dingy on his next turn, and Vim prevents him from doing that. I also briefly looked at playing Twit down the L column for 25, but didn't like that this kept the M and the V together on my rack, which is a bit awkward, and also put a T between 2 triple word scores, which could yield big scores to Chris in response if he has the right tiles. So when all was said and done, I settled on Vim, which the computer simulation does agree was the right call. Chris made a very interesting play in this position. He played his A, and only his A, for 4 points with the word aid. And this play tells me a lot. If you're playing a strong player, especially early in the game, and they play a single tile for just a couple of points, you can pretty much always infer that they are very close to a bingo and anticipating playing a bingo on their next turn. Otherwise, there would be no reason to justify taking such a small score with such little tile turnover. So, what did this tell me? It told me that Chris very likely was holding 6 bingo-prone tiles, and bingo-prone tiles in Scrabble tend to be low-scoring tiles, like the vowels and NRT. Maybe a couple 2-point tiles as well, like the D. But Chris most likely did not have any high-scoring tiles on his rack when he made this play, and that significantly influenced my decision here. I played the word Ottava for 20 points through the V in Verity, and normally this looks very dangerous putting an O in a triple word score line. But once again, I figured that Chris was about to bingo here. I figured he didn't have a tile like the X that would really hurt me. Sure, he could have drawn it, but the odds of that are extremely slim since he only played off 1 tile, so he only would have had 1 chance to do that. I figured with this play, if Chris bingos elsewhere on the board, then with my W, and possibly some other high-scoring tiles I might get by drawing 5 out of the bag, I might be the one who's more likely to hit that scoring spot. And this logic is sound in principle, however, here I think the problem is that when Chris bingos on his next turn, he often inadvertently blocks that scoring spot. After this play, Chris is very often going to be bingoing on row 4 under the O in Ottava, or on row 5 hooking aid as he just set up, and both of these plays are going to end up blocking the big plays I'm going for down the H column. So I think this was good thinking, but not exactly the right execution. Probably here I want to go with something a little bit more standard, such as just playing WAT for 23 down the K column. This keeps a bit of a vowel-heavy leave, but at least it unduplicates my A's and my T's and gets rid of my W. So I think here, guys, I let the knowledge I had based on Chris's last play influence me just a little bit too much. And as a result, I'm often going to end up having to deal with this W on future turns that isn't going to have a great spot on this board. So a good lesson here, it's always important to think about what your opponent's last play can tell you about their rack, but it's also important not to over-adjust when you're doing too much harm to your own rack. So I think a slight mistake here, but a very educational position. Chris, as expected, bingoed. He played aperies for 74 points on the 2 row above the O in Ottava. Interestingly, this play is a bit risky, as aperies takes a front J for japeries and a front N for naperies. That definitely explains why Chris didn't want to play the same bingo over here, because now, if I drew the J out of the bag, the J would land on a double letter score, and if I'm able to play a 5-letter word vertically starting with that J, I'm going to be getting close to 100 points, which would be a disaster for Chris. So definitely the smart play on Chris's part, at least if you're going to give back those front hooks, give them away in a less dangerous spot. I certainly wasn't surprised to see Chris play a bingo given his fish for 4 points on the last turn, but I needed to figure out the best way to respond. I pretty quickly slapped down the 56-point Waxen under aperies, making 5 overlaps, as it looked like it was going to be hard to do better than this. However, I have another alternative that merits serious consideration, namely Gnaw for 46 points down the A column, hooking the N to make naperies. This is 10 fewer points than Waxen, but the key difference is it keeps the X, which is a deceptively strong tile on this board. With my leave of EEX, I could play a word under aid and me on the 9 row, ending in EX, which would score over 40 points. If that gets taken, I could also play something on the 4 row, under so, hooking socks, which would score very well too. So I'm guaranteed to have a very nice option with my X on the next turn. And interestingly, computer simulation has Gnaw, despite scoring 10 points fewer than my play of Waxen as the superior option. So that just goes to show you guys how powerful a tile the X really is in this position. And I think the lesson here is don't think about what tiles you're keeping on your rack just in terms of what those tiles are. Make sure you're thinking about how good those tiles are for the board in hand. Because on another board, the X might not be that good a tile. It might even be a liability if there aren't any good spots for it. But on this board, the X is actually a huge asset. So yet another very interesting and instructive turn. Chris was showing no signs of slowing down after his first bingo, pulling the blank out of the bag. He's got a lot of playable bingos here. One of them stands out as best by a good margin, but it's really tricky to see. The 9-letter Exonumist down the D column scores 86 points. Chris didn't see this, but like I said, it's really, really tough, and there are probably only a small number of players who would find this over the board. He instead played Tinamu for 73 points on the 5 row, which is about as good as you're going to do in this position if you don't find the 9. Chris takes an 88-point lead, and I have drawn the J out of the bag. And this is yet another very complicated turn. I at first thought about playing Jag through the A and Gallier for 22 points, which keeps a super strong bingo lead of E, E, N, R, T. However, I was starting to get worried about the state of this board, because without having an S to hook maids or otavas, it was going to be pretty difficult for me to get a bingo down. And I also figured at this point, having this large a lead, Chris was going to start playing significant amounts of defense. So I didn't really like my prospects of getting a bingo down immediately after this play, and thus discarded it. I also considered Jaeger in the same spot for 30, blowing the board open a little bit more, but once again, I figured Chris would likely play through the R on the right, and leave me with not a lot of great places to play a bingo. So instead, I came up with another very interesting tactic, playing Jet for 29 points on the 4 row, keeping E, G, R, N. This looks a little bit crazy at first, because it seems to just donate easy 40-point plays for Chris down the A column from the J. But I actually did that on purpose. I figured here, there's a sense of urgency. I'm down 90 points, and I really need to try to bingo quickly to get back into this game. So I'm actually trying to entice Chris to play from the J, because if he does that, he's not only going to be leaving me the letters in Gallier to play through on the right, which I really need, he's also going to be opening some more space for 7s down the B column and creating a much more bingo-friendly board in the long run, which is what I'm going to need to make a comeback. So a bit of a counterintuitive play here, giving up more points in the short term, but setting myself up better for the comeback in the long term. I was really happy with this play, and the computer simulation does back it up. And Chris still was not slowing down. He pulls the other blank and 2 more S's out of the bag. He's got a lot of playable bingos here once again. His highest scoring one is Cassius for 80 points down the N column. He saw a couple of bingos here, but didn't like them because of the counterplay they gave back on the O column. He ended up playing Courses for 68 points, hooking maids, which is considerably more defensive. I think here, though, Chris's best option is actually not to bingo at all. He can play Jukos for 42 points from the J, taking out that scoring spot and jumping up by 100 points. He also keeps the super powerful ES blank lead, so it's going to be pretty hard to imagine him not bingoing and compounding his lead even further on his next turn. Definitely a tough play to make over the board, but computer simulation does agree this would have been best. In any case, like I said, Chris played Courses for 68, and this still puts him very much in command, up by 127 points. Would I be able to come back? Let's see. My decision to play Jet paid off, because I left open the A in Gallier, which is exactly what I needed with my rack of E, G, N, O, R, R, S. I very quickly played Groaners, my only playable bingo, for 74 points, getting myself back to within striking distance, but Chris is still up by 53. And he finds a really nice play here. From a clunky rack, he plays Aguish for 30 points, scoring well, dumping a bunch of tiles, and, most importantly, blocking the dangerous S in Groaners in the triple line. Chris is once again up by over 80, and it's now my turn. This is another position where, given the state of the board and the current score, I felt a sense of urgency to be proactive about keeping the board open. Note that there are no S's left, so I can't count on drawing an S and trying to hit a bingo down the N column hooking otavas. And I was worried if I just took 36 points for joint. Number one, keeping CRW on my rack is going to make it very difficult for me to bingo on my next turn, and it's hard to imagine overcoming this deficit without a bingo. And number two, most of my good bingo lines on this board are concentrated down at the C, D, E columns through the letters in Courses. And it's not that hard for Chris to block all of these at once with a play in that area. So I was worried after joint, Chris would play in that part of the board, wall me in, and I would have little hope for a comeback. As such, I sacrificed some points playing Gown for 24 from the G in Groaners. I do score 12 fewer points, which is a lot, but I get rid of my troublesome W, and I create another line on the bottom with the N in Gown, which could prove very useful for me, and possibly annoying for Chris to block. After Gown, Chris didn't play any defense, but he played a lot of offense, scoring 45 points by extending his previous play of Aguish to Aguishly on the triple. You guys may be wondering, yeah, this is a lot of points for Chris, but he's up so much, why wouldn't he try to play some bingo defense? Isn't that more important? And I would say it is important, but he's scoring so many points here, he actually takes a 100 plus point lead, that he probably outruns my bingos in the majority of cases. And if he tries to sacrifice too many points to play bingo defense, There are enough bingo lines now on this board, thanks to my play of Gown, that he runs the risk of me bingoing in a line he doesn't block and then having enough points to overcome him in the endgame. So I think his strategy here of just outrunning and keeping the scoring pressure on makes a lot of sense. Like I said, Chris is now once again up over 100 points, and I drew the Z out of the bag, which wasn't really what I was hoping for since I was going for a bingo. I played Whiz here for 35 points from the W in Gown. This does partially obstruct the N, but I figured at this point in the game, I'm going to need a very high-scoring bingo, not just a bingo to come back and win. So if I'm going for that N, I'm probably going for a bingo ending in the N anyway, since that would enable me to reach the triple word score. So I wasn't too concerned about blocking low-scoring 60-ish point bingos with Whiz. This also just scores so well and keeps such a fantastic lead, it feels like it has to be the right play. Chris now plays Rough for 18 points through the R in courses. This looks like a pretty good play, getting rid of some clunky tiles and blocking a couple of bingo lines. Following Whiz, I had Ceeilrt. I have a single playable bingo here, and it doesn't score a lot, but it's still a bingo, so I gotta do it. It is Electric through the C in courses for 66 points. Now, while I was glad to have a bingo, I still was not feeling very good at all about my prospects to win the game after Electric, because I knew that I would still be down 20 points, it would be Chris's turn, and I'm opening a big scoring spot on the A column. So, still not feeling optimistic, but feeling like I have maybe an outside shot. 364-343, Chris leads by 21, and he makes a very logical play here, Ba for 45 points, scoring really well and preventing me from scoring myself in that spot. And here, guys, comes the moment of truth. Chris has left one tile in the bag after Ba, and I am down 66 points. I've got EIKLOOR. Being down 66 with just one in the bag and no available bingos here, I at first thought it's going to be pretty tough to win this game. But then I took a closer look at the unseen tiles. They are absolutely dreadful. The 8 unseen tiles to me at this point are B, D, 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 N, O, P, Q. And I know that 7 of these 8 clunkers are sitting on Chris's rack right now, and just one of them is in the bag. So then I was like, okay, if Chris has all of this garbage, and he's unable to play most of it off on his next turn, if I can go out on my subsequent turn, I'm going to be getting a lot of bonus points from all of these high-scoring unplayed tiles on Chris's rack, and maybe, just maybe, if I can score well now, and score well while playing out on my next turn, I might actually be able to catch him. And that's when I noticed I actually have a very high-scoring play available in this position. I can play either Kilo or Colo on the top row above Aperies and Waxen. And this scores well, it scores 40 points. But I'm still going to be down 26 points after this play. So I needed to think about, after Chris's next turn, how am I still going to be able to go out for enough points to catch him? And that's when I noticed the 13 row, starting with the C in Electric, could yield some high-scoring outplays, because Rough takes a back E. So if I can get a 5-letter word starting with the C and with the E in the 4th position, that might actually be enough to beat Chris in the endgame. So then I started thinking about which of Colo or Kilo gives me a better shot at getting an outplay there. And the answer is Kilo, because either of these plays give me an outplay there with a D draw. Kilo would give me quarter coder, and Colo would give me cider. But after Kilo, I can also draw an O for Cooer or a P for Coper in that spot. If I played Colo, there are no draws besides the D that give me an outplay in that spot. So I figured, given that, Kilo had to be at least as good as Colo. So at this point, for context, I was starting to get pretty low on the clock, probably about 2 minutes left. So I wanted to fixate on the case of drawing a D because that's by far the most likely. There are 3 Ds in the bag, and only 1 of each other tile, so I'm 3 times as likely to draw a D as any other tile. That is the most likely and important case for me to fixate on. So the question became, does Kilo win assuming I draw the D? That's what I needed to calculate. And I was on time able to determine that yes, it does, but barely. I'll show you the different variations in just a minute. But like I said, I determined that Kilo was a win with a D. I didn't have enough time to determine with certainty whether Kilo would win me the game with an O or a P draw, but I was certain it would win with a D draw, and I felt pretty confident that Colo was not any better, because like I said, with draws other than a D, I'm not threatening any high-scoring outplays. So I figured Kilo wins at least 3 out of 8, maybe more, but it's at least as good as Colo, so I might as well go for it and just see what happens. I'll talk about the other variations after the game, but as luck would have it, the tile gods were on my side, and I did indeed draw one of the 3 Ds. So that left Chris with the rack of B, D, D, N, O, P, Q. And Chris here is lost. He has a play that loses by 1 point, a play that loses by 2 points, and a play that loses by 3 points. He made the play that loses by 3 points, the most obvious one, namely dropping the Q for 21 points. Let me show you exactly why this loses by 3 points. After this play, Chris goes up 430 to 383. Again, this is a large lead, 47 points. It feels like it ought to be enough to hold on. But as I planned out, I went out for a lot of points from the C and electric. I played chord for 26, bringing myself to within 21 points of Chris. But Chris has a total of 12 points left on his rack between B, D, D, and O, P. So I get double that, or 24 points, as an additional penalty for Chris's unplayed tiles, and that brings me to 433. So I ended up winning this game by 3, 433 to 430. And what I find particularly remarkable about this win is I was down basically the entire way. There was a single point in this game prior to the conclusion where I had the lead. After I played a Tava on turn 3, I was ahead by 3 points. That was an extremely short-lived lead. And after that, I was down the whole way until I made my outplay. Even after I made my outplay, I was still down. It was only after adding the penalty for Chris's unplayed tiles that I was able to win the game. So I just find that pretty remarkable, and it goes to show you gotta never give up in this game. You never know what you'll be able to pull off. In any case, like I said, this is what happened, but I want to talk about some of the other variations. I mentioned how instead of Chi, Chris technically has slightly better plays that could have lost by 2 or just 1. One such play is Poined through the Iron Verity for 28 points. This would have lost for Chris by 2. And it's a little counterintuitive since it doesn't get rid of the 10-point Q, but it scores a lot more and also sheds more other tiles from Chris's rack. If Chris had played this, I of course still would have gone out with Chord for 26, and when all was said and done, I would now get 30 points from Chris's unplayed B, D, Q, and the game would end at 439 to 437, a 2-point win in my favor. Now, Chris's best option in this position is not Chi or Poined, it is Odd for 20 points down the D column, and this would lose by a single point. The idea here is Chris sacrifices some points, and he keeps more points on his rack, both of which don't seem good, but he blocks my highest scoring outplay by a large margin of Chord. So if Chris plays Odd, he's going to take a 46-point lead holding B, N, P, Q. After I go out, I'm going to get 34 points from his unplayed B, N, P, Q. So given that and that I'm down 46 now, I need 46 minus 34 or 12 points with DEOR as an outplay to tie the game, or 13 to win. And it turns out I can get exactly 13, with the tricky to see ORed down the M column, making ER, RE, and ID as 2-letter overlaps. Once again, if I play this, then after I get the 34 points from Chris's rack, I win by a single point, 430 to 429. So while Odd would have been Chris's best response in the position where he played Chi and I ended up winning by 3, he didn't have a winning play in the position after Kilo. And this is precisely what I had calculated. I knew that if I drew a D and Chris was facing this position, he was not going to be able to win the game. And that is why I played Kilo, knowing full well that at least 3 out of 8 times I was going to win the game. So you can imagine I was very satisfied when I did indeed pull one of the 3 Ds, and this plan all worked out exactly as I had drawn it up. Now, I still want to briefly address the question of whether Kilo in this position does end up winning if I draw an O for Cooer or a P for Coper. It does turn out, as I suspected during the game, that Colo, like Kilo, wins if I draw the D. But as it turns out, Colo does not win with any tiles other than the D. It happens that Kilo, as I'm about to show you guys, would have won the game for me with an O draw, but would have lost with a P draw. Like I said, I didn't have time to figure this out during the game, but I knew that at a minimum, Kilo would win with a D draw and maybe some other letters, so that's why I went with it. Let me show you each of these possibilities. If I draw the O, then I am going to win the game. Chris is going to be vowelless, holding the horrendous rack of B, triple D, and PQ. If he plays Chi, as he did in the actual game, then he's going to fall short, because I go out with Cooer scoring 24 points, and I get a lot from his unplayed tiles. Specifically, I'm going to get 26 and win the game with the exact same score as in the actual variation, 433 to 430. Now, you might be thinking, okay, well, what if Chris instead tries to block Cooer? Can Chris even block Cooer? After all, he has no vowels and can't play odd down the D column as he did before. Well, it turns out he can block Cooer in only one way. He has to drop a single tile next to the Owen gown. Let's say he plays bow for 7 points. If he does this, then I don't have Cooer, but I have another very sneaky outplay. I can play roofer on the 11 row through the R in electric and the F in rough, and that's going to be enough to win. Because I am not scoring a lot on my outplay, but I am getting so many points from Chris's unplayed tiles. I'm getting an astonishing 40 points from DDDNPQ still on Chris's rack, and I win this game comfortably by 16, 432 to 416. So if I draw the O after Kilo, then whatever Chris does, whether he lets me have Cooer or blocks it, he is lost. So Kilo would have won for me with an O draw in addition to a D draw. The other tile we wanted to look at was the P, because if I draw the P after Kilo, I'm going to be threatening Coper from the C in electric. As I'll show you guys, this actually would have allowed Chris to win the game. If I pull the P, then Chris will be sitting on BDDDNOQ. I'll leave you guys to check the math that, as in the other variations, Chi would lose by 3 points for Chris if I go out with Coper. However, here, the play of odd does get the job done for Chris. Because after odd, I am not going to be able to go out for enough points with EOPR. My best outplay would be ropey for 11 points on the bottom right, bringing me to 394. And while I do get 32 points from Chris's unplayed tiles, it's not enough, and Chris now is the one who's going to win by 3, 429 to 426. It's worth just mentioning that when I go out with ropey here, I don't have a better option, and in particular, I cannot stick Chris with the Q, because he has not only Chi next to the I in electric, but he can also play Chi for 11 next to the I in Verity. So if I don't go out here, Chris gets to unload his Q and score some points, and it's pretty clear that he's going to hold on and win easily. So in this position, all I can do is go out and take my 3-point loss. So, once again, Kilo in the original position was indeed my best play, winning 4 out of 8. 3 out of 8 with either of the 3 Ds, as I correctly calculated, and also another 1 out of 8 for a total of 4 out of 8 with the O. Colo, as it turns out, would have won just 3 out of 8, winning only when I drew a D. So I did indeed make the correct pre-endgame play here. And like I said before, it did pay off as I drew a D and ended up winning by 3, 433 to 430, with the final position back on the board here. Now, you guys may recall how at the beginning of this video, I mentioned how this at first seemed like a meaningless game, because I had already clinched my berth in the finals against Ian 2 games ago, and I was going to be there whether or not I won this game against Chris. However, it actually turned out to be pivotal in a very subtle but important way. Winning this game against Chris meant that I finished ahead of Ian in the standings through the first 28 games. Ian and I had the same record at 23-5, but I had the higher point spread, so I finished higher than him. If I had lost to Chris this game, then Ian would have had the higher final record after 28 games, because he would have been 23-5 and I would have been 22-6. Now, what does that mean? Well, on the surface, it would seem like nothing, because the rule is the top 2 players get into the final after round 28. So whether I was first or Ian was first and I was second, it was going to be me and Ian in the final. But here's the catch, and I only realized this when I sat down to play the finals against Ian on the next day. The finalist who finishes higher in the standings gets to go first in odd-numbered games in the final. What does this mean? If the final goes the distance and we end up playing all 5 games, then the higher finishing finalist gets to go first in games 1, 3, and 5, so 3 out of the 5 games total. Now, going first in Scrabble is not a massive advantage, but it's definitely a clear advantage. Computer simulation shows that between 2 equally matched opponents, whoever goes first typically wins on average about 55% of the time. So, again, not a gigantic advantage, but definitely not a negligible one. And as it so happens in this particular final, the games were so close down the stretch that it's possible being able to go first in 3 games as opposed to just 2 games may have made the difference in me winning the title. In particular, I went first in games 3 and 5. Game 3 was a big comeback where I was down over 100 points and managed to claw my way back to victory. And Game 5, as you guys have probably seen, was one of the most intense roller coasters of a Scrabble game you'll ever see that was super tight the whole way, and I ended up clinching in a really tight endgame that could have truly gone either direction. I didn't win that game until the very last play. So, given how tight these games were, it's possible that had I not gone first, had Ian had the first play, that one turn could have made the difference. Of course, we'll never know for sure, but it's interesting to think about that possibility. That my victory against Chris in this game, which again, I at first approached as a completely meaningless game of Scrabble, could have made the difference in me ultimately winning the title. Just a super bizarre twist of fate there that I honestly didn't even process until after I'd won the championship. When I was going through the process of analyzing the finals games and realizing how close they were, I had the thought like, wow, the fact that I went first in these games, especially Game 5, which, like I said, was literally decided on the last play, could have made the difference. And that's when I realized, wait a minute, if I hadn't beaten Chris Cree in round 28, Ian would have gone first in those games, and everything would have been different. So, like I said, guys, just an absolutely wild and ironic twist of fate there. And I guess the lesson is, never take anything for granted. Even if a game or a decision seems meaningless, you just never know. So it's important in these tournaments, especially on the biggest stage, to never shut down. Always play your best, always stay in it as much as possible. Besides the fact that being able to go first in 3 games might have made a difference, it was also just a nice win for me here to have a confidence boost going into the finals against Ian. Because pulling off this improbable comeback against Chris gave me some confidence that, okay, even if I'm struggling early on in the game, maybe dealing with some tough draws or some tough decisions, I still have what it takes to mount a big comeback and play a good pre-endgame and come back for an exciting win. And wow, could that not have been more relevant given the way several of my matches against Ian transpired? So, just a very odd sequence of events. Like I said, a very good sequence of events from my perspective, but just very odd how this game was so foreshadowing of the finals, not only because it allowed me to go first, but also just because the trajectory of this game and the mentality I needed to have to win this game was so similar to the mentality I needed to have to win my roller coaster of a finals match against Ian. So, pretty wild stuff there, guys. Really hope you enjoyed this game and this video overall. Let me know, as always, what you think of this game in the comments section. Many more SPC recap videos to come on my channel in the coming weeks. Please stay tuned. As always, thank you all so much for watching this video and for supporting my channel. Really, really appreciate it. And I look forward to seeing you all soon for the next video. Thanks again, guys. Have a good one. Bye-bye.